On November 13th, 1909, 259 men and boys walked into the St. Paul mine in Cherry, Illinois. They were carrying lunch pails, headlamps, and the quiet expectation that they would come home that night. Most of them did not. By the end of that week, the company that owned the mine had given an order so cold, so calculated, that it would haunt American labor history for the next 100 years. They told the rescue teams to stop. They told the firefighters to walk away. They ordered the shaft sealed with men still alive inside it. And the official reason they gave for doing this, the reason printed in the newspapers and entered into the federal record, does not match what later investigators would find when they finally went back down into that hole. If you want to understand how the modern world was actually built, and who paid for it, and what they buried to keep it quiet, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the story of Cherry, Illinois is not a story about a mine fire. It is a story about an entire economic system that treated human beings as a line item, and a federal response that, for reasons we are about to walk through, looked less like an investigation and more like a cleanup. The official record says 259 men died because a coal car full of hay caught fire next to a kerosene torch. The official record is missing several important details. We are going to put them back in. To understand what happened in Cherry on that Saturday afternoon, you have to understand what Cherry was. The town did not exist before the mine. It was built all at once in 1905 on a patch of prairie about 100 miles southwest of Chicago. The St. Paul Coal Company, which was a subsidiary of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, needed coal to feed its locomotives. So the railroad company built a mine. And then, because the mine needed workers and the workers needed somewhere to live, the railroad company built a town. Streets, houses, a company store, a school, all of it owned by the same corporation that owned the mine. The workers paid rent to the company. They bought groceries from the company. They were paid in company scrip in the early years, which meant the money the company gave them only worked at the store the company owned. If you have ever heard the phrase company town, this is what it means. It is not a metaphor. It is a closed economic loop where the corporation owns the means of production, the means of housing, the means of consumption, and in many practical senses, the means of escape. Cherry was not unique. There were thousands of these towns across the United States in the early 20th century. They sprang up like mushrooms wherever there was coal, iron, copper, timber, or railroad track being laid. And here is where the revisionist history starts to matter. The standard textbook tells you that America industrialized in a steady, organic, inevitable way through the 19th century. Inventors invented, capitalists invested, workers worked, and gradually the country became modern. That is the bedtime story. The actual record, if you go to look at the census numbers and the labor data and the mortality statistics, tells a different story. Between roughly 1870 and 1910, the United States went from a country that was mostly farmland and small towns to a country with the largest industrial base on Earth. That transformation did not happen gradually. It happened in a single human lifetime. It was built almost entirely on the bodies of immigrants and children working in conditions that, by any reasonable standard, were a form of organized human sacrifice. The men who walked into the Cherry mine that morning were almost all immigrants. Italians from the south, Lithuanians, Slovaks, Poles, Belgians, French. Many of them had been in America for less than 5 years. Some had been in America for less than 5 months. They did not speak English well, or at all. They could not read the safety notices the company posted. They could not read their own contracts. They had been brought to Cherry by labor recruiters who promised them steady work and a roof, and the steady work and the roof were technically delivered, but the rest of the deal had been written in a language they could not understand. They were paid less than American-born workers. They were given the most dangerous assignments. When something went wrong, as it did on November 13th, the company that had recruited them, housed them, and paid them made decisions about their lives without consulting them or their families. The mine itself had 3 veins. The second vein, about 300 feet down, was the main working level. The third vein, about 500 feet down, was deeper. The shaft connecting them was an enclosed vertical tunnel with a wooden lining. The mine was lit in 1909 by kerosene torches. This detail is important because by 1909 electric lighting was widely available. It had been available for decades. The St. Paul mine had, in fact, been equipped with electric lights, but the electrical system had been malfunctioning for weeks, and rather than fix it, the company had simply gone back to open flame torches. Open flame torches in a coal mine. Open flame torches around hay bales used to feed the mule teams that hauled the coal cars. If you were a mining engineer in 1909 or 1809 for that matter, you already know what is about to happen. The men in the mine did not, because they were not engineers. They were immigrants who had been told to push the coal cars and shovel the coal and trust that someone somewhere had thought about their safety. Around 1 in the afternoon, a coal car carrying 6 bales of hay was pushed past one of these kerosene torches in the second vein. The hay caught fire. This is the moment the official story begins, and it is also the moment the official story starts to crack. The men working nearby saw the fire start. They tried to put it out. They poured water on it. They tried to push the burning car deeper into the mine where the ventilation might starve the flames. None of it worked. The reason none of it worked, the reason a small hay fire became a catastrophe, was that the mine's ventilation system was running in the wrong direction. The fans that were supposed to pull smoke out of the shaft were instead pushing fresh air down into the fire and pulling the smoke laterally through the tunnels where the men were working. The fire grew. It found the wooden timbers that held up the mine roof. It found the wooden lining of the shaft itself. Within an hour, the entire shaft was a chimney. Some men got out. 12 of them rode the cage up to the surface on its first emergency trip. They were burned, choking, half blind. The cage went back down. It came back with more men. It went down again. On that third trip, the cage operator could not bring it back up because the cables had caught fire. The cage stopped working. The main shaft was now impassable. There were still about 200 men underground. Here is where the decision was made that would define everything that came after. The mine had a second shaft, an escape shaft, designed exactly for situations like this. It was a smaller vertical tunnel with its own ladder and its own ventilation. Some of the men trapped underground knew about it. Some did not. The ones who knew started moving toward it. They organized themselves. They put wet cloths over their faces. They walked through the smoke in the dark for hundreds of yards. About 60 of them made it to the escape shaft and climbed out alive. The rest, somewhere between 100 and 150 men, were still down there, alive, trying to find a way out. That evening, the company made its decision. The mine superintendent, in consultation with company officials in Chicago, gave the order to seal the shaft, cover the main entrance, cover the escape shaft, cut off the oxygen. The reasoning, as it was later given in testimony, was that the fire could not be controlled and that sealing the mine was the only way to prevent it from spreading further and destroying the entire operation. The men still alive inside, the company said, were probably already dead from smoke. There was no way to know. The property had to be protected. Read that sentence again. The property had to be protected. The shaft was sealed at approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of November 13th. The men inside were not all dead. Some of them, we know now, lived for another full week. 21 of them, deep in the third vein, had found a pocket of breathable air. They had managed to build a small barricade out of mud and timber to keep the smoke out. They had a little water from a seep in the rock. They sat there in absolute darkness for 8 days. They prayed. They wrote letters home with pencils on scraps of paper. One of them, a man named George Eddy, wrote out a will leaving his wages to his wife. Another wrote a goodbye to his mother in Italy. They listened in that darkness for any sound from above. They heard nothing. They did not know that the mine had been sealed against them. They did not know that the company had decided they were already dead. They only knew that no rescue was coming, and that the air was getting thinner. On the third day after the sealing, public pressure from the families gathered above the shaft became too intense for the company to ignore. The wives and mothers and children of the missing men had been camped at the mine entrance since the fire began. They had watched the company seal the shaft. They had begged. They had screamed. They had been held back by company guards. On the third day, the seals were broken partially. Rescue teams were finally allowed to descend, wearing the primitive smoke helmets that were the period equivalent of a self-contained breathing apparatus. They found bodies. They counted bodies. They came back up. They went down again the next day and the day after. On the 8th day, November 21st, a rescue team in the third vein heard a faint sound, a tapping. They moved toward it, and they found the 21 men. 20 had survived. One had died only hours earlier. They had been alive the entire time the mine was sealed. They had been alive the entire time the company was telling reporters that everyone underground was certainly dead. They had been alive while the company calculated whether their bodies were worth retrieving. And here is what the standard history does with this fact. It treats the survival of those 20 as a miracle. It treats the disaster as a tragedy. It uses the word accident a great deal. And what it does not do, what almost no popular account of the Cherry Mine disaster does, is ask the deeper question. Why was the mine being run this way in the first place? Why were there kerosene torches in 1909? Why were the ventilation fans running the wrong direction? Why was a hay car being moved past an open flame? Why were the men inside this mine almost all immigrants who could not read the warning signs? And most importantly, why did the company believe when it gave the order to seal the shaft that it had the legal and moral authority to do so? The answer to all of these questions is the same answer, and it is an answer that the standard story of American industrialization does not want you to think about for very long. The men in the Cherry Mine were not, in the eyes of the company, fully equivalent to other Americans. They were a labor input. They were a commodity that had been imported, housed, and deployed against a coal seam. Their deaths were a cost of doing business, and that cost had been priced into the operation from the day the mine was built. The kerosene torches were cheaper than fixing the electrical system. The malfunctioning ventilation was cheaper than redesigning it. The hiring of immigrants who could not read English was cheaper than hiring workers who could. The sealing of the shaft was cheaper than a prolonged rescue operation. Every decision the company made, including the decision to leave men to suffocate in the dark, was a decision driven by accounting. This is the part of the story that the official record handles by simply not handling it. The federal investigation that followed the disaster, such as it was, focused on the mechanics of the fire. The state of Illinois held hearings. A coroner's jury was convened. The company paid out small settlements to the families on the order of about $1,800 per dead worker, which was less than the cost of replacing the burned timbers in the shaft. No one from the company went to prison. No executive resigned. The mine reopened within months. The town of Cherry continued to exist, owned by the same corporation, working the same coal seam with most of the same equipment. But something did change after Cherry, and this is where the revisionist economic historian has to pay close attention. The disaster became, in the years that followed, one of the foundational arguments for the creation of the Federal Bureau of Mines, for the passage of workers' compensation laws in Illinois and elsewhere, and for a broad public reconsideration of what an industrial corporation was allowed to do to its workers. The standard story tells you that these reforms were the natural progress of an enlightened society. The standard story tells you that America saw what happened at Cherry and decided to do better. The actual record is more complicated. The reforms that came after Cherry were not gifts. They were not the spontaneous awakening of corporate conscience. They were extracted painfully from a system that had built itself on the assumption that human life was the cheapest raw material in the economy. And the people who extracted those reforms were the widows and the brothers and the friends of the men who died in that mine. They organized, they lobbied, they sued, they marched, they built unions, and the corporations for the first time were forced to put a higher price on the human input. That is the revisionist reading of what Cherry actually means. It means that the modern American labour protections you may take for granted, the workers' compensation, the OSHA inspections, the right of a worker to refuse an unsafe job, all of these were not handed down. They were paid for in advance by men who suffocated in the dark while their employer counted the cost of saving them and decided against it. And here is the part that connects this story to a larger pattern that, once you start looking for it, you can see in almost every corner of the period between roughly 1850 and 1920. The infrastructure of the modern world, the railroads and the steel mills and the coal mines and the factories and the canals and the buildings that you now look at and call American history, was built on a human cost that the standard history either does not mention or mentions briefly and moves past. It is not a small cost. It is, by some estimates, hundreds of thousands of industrial deaths in the United States alone during this period. Whole towns of widows, whole generations of fatherless children, whole communities of immigrants who came to this country expecting a chance at something better and found instead a coal seam that ended their lives at the age of 27. If you want to understand the architecture of the modern world, you have to understand the labour pool that built it, and you have to understand the conditions under which they worked. And if you start to look at it through that lens, certain other questions begin to surface. Questions about how exactly a country that was largely agrarian in 1860 had become the most industrialized nation on earth by 1910. Questions about where the capital came from. Questions about where the workers came from. Questions about why, when you look at the records of this period, you find a strange pattern of cities that seem to grow faster than the materials and the labour available to build them could possibly account for. Questions about why so many of the great buildings of that era, the courthouses and the World's Fair pavilions and the great train stations, were said to have been built in 18 months or 2 years, using methods we now would consider impossible. The official answer to these questions is always the same: American ingenuity, the grit of the immigrant worker, the miracle of industrial capital. The unofficial answer, the one that some researchers have been quietly assembling for the last several decades, is that the standard story of the 19th century leaves out a great deal. It leaves out the deaths, it leaves out the scale, it leaves out the way capital and labour were marshalled in ways that, if you proposed them today, would be considered a war crime. It leaves out the children. There were children in the Cherry mine that day. 8 of them between the ages of 12 and 14 were among the dead. They had been working as door tenders, opening and closing the ventilation doors as the coal cars passed. They were paid about 75 cents a day. The youngest, a boy named Tony, was 12 years old. His father was also working in the mine that day. They died together. Their bodies were found in the same tunnel. The coroner's inquest in Cherry began on November 20th, while the bodies were still being brought up. The transcript of that inquest is one of the strangest documents in the entire labour history of the period. The questioning was conducted by a local jury, most of whom were merchants and farmers from the surrounding county, none of whom had any expertise in mining. The witnesses called were almost entirely company officials. The surviving miners, the ones who had lived through it, were called only briefly, and several testified in Italian or Lithuanian through interpreters whose translations were never independently verified. The official finding, when it came, was that the disaster had been caused by an unfortunate accident involving the proximity of hay to an open flame, that no individual could be held criminally responsible, and that the company had acted in good faith in its decision to seal the shaft. The jury thanked the company for its cooperation. The hearings closed in less than 2 weeks. The record was, for all practical purposes, filed away. There are pieces of testimony that survived in the local Illinois newspapers of the time, statements from survivors who described the moments before the sealing, that contradict the official finding in ways the jury did not pursue. One survivor told a reporter he had heard the cage operator say, just before the cables burned, that there were dozens of men still gathering at the bottom of the main shaft, waiting for the cage to come back down. Another said he had seen company officials at the surface refusing to let volunteer rescuers descend into the escape shaft on the second day, on the grounds that the air inside was too dangerous and the company could not assume liability. There were men in town that night, miners from neighbouring operations, who had brought their own equipment and were prepared to go down. They were turned away. The official record does not mention this. The official record does not mention the volunteers. It records only that the company acted with all due diligence and with the safety of the rescue workers as its primary concern. What you are looking at when you read the inquest transcript and then read the newspaper accounts side by side is the moment when a historical event gets cleaned up for the archive. The messy details, the contradictions, the volunteer rescuers turned away, the cage operator who knew men were waiting at the bottom, the question of why the ventilation fans were running the wrong direction in the first place. All of it gets smoothed over into a single sanitary phrase. Unfortunate accident, good faith, due diligence. Once those phrases are in the official record, they become the version of events that future historians, working from the official record, will repeat. This is how the receipts get buried. Not by hiding them exactly, but by writing a cleaner version on top of them and citing the cleaner version for the next 100 years. There is a memorial in Cherry now, on the site of the old mine. It lists the names of the dead, 259 of them. If you stand there and you read the names, you will notice something the engraver could not have hidden, even if he had wanted to. The names are not American names. They are Sicilian and Calabrian and Lithuanian and Slovak. They are the names of people who came to this country to build the railroad that owned the mine that killed them. They are the labour pool of the Industrial Revolution, written in stone on a prairie in Illinois, where almost no one ever visits. The reason this matters, the reason a story from 1909 still matters in your life right now, is that the system that built Cherry has not exactly disappeared. The structure of it, the closed economic loop where a corporation owns the housing and the wages and the working conditions of a labour force that has limited ability to leave, still exists in various forms. The use of immigrant labour for the most dangerous work still exists. The calculation of human life as a cost to be priced into the operation still exists. The sealing of the shaft, the moment when an institution decides that saving a person is more expensive than letting them die, still exists. It just happens in different ways now, in different industries, with different paperwork. What Cherry teaches, if you read it the way the revisionist historian reads it, is that the modern world is not the result of a long arc bending toward justice. The modern world is the result of a long arc that was bent, repeatedly and at great cost, by the people who refuse to be the line item in someone else's spreadsheet. The protections you have, the safety standards, the right to organise, the right to a wage that does not have to be spent at the company store, were all bent into existence by people who had nothing left to lose. The moment those people stop bending, the moment the pressure comes off, the arc tends to snap back toward where it started. The mine itself stayed open until 1927. It produced coal for another 18 years after the fire. The St. Paul Coal Company merged into other entities, those entities merged into still others, and the corporate trail eventually disappears into the long chain of mergers and acquisitions that characterize the railroad and energy sector of the 20th century. There is no one company you can point to today and say, that company sealed the shaft. The decision was made by men whose names appear briefly in the newspapers of the period and then vanish from the record. They were not punished, they were promoted, they moved to other companies, they continued to make decisions about other workers in other places, and the bodies, most of them were eventually recovered. A few were never found. The deepest parts of the third vein were sealed permanently in the years after the disaster, and there are, by some accounts, still human remains in that mine. The town of Cherry still exists. It has a population of about 500. There is a small museum. There is the memorial. There is a cemetery where many of the dead are buried, often in unmarked graves because their families could not afford headstones. There is, on the site of the old shaft, a flat patch of ground where, if you stand on it on a quiet day, you can hear nothing at all. No fires, no machinery, no voices, just the wind moving across the prairie and the silence of a place where, on a Saturday afternoon in November of 1909, the corporation that owned the world decided that the men inside the mine were worth less than the timber in the walls. The question the standard history will not ask is the question you have to ask yourself now. What other shafts have been sealed since then? What other men, in what other industries, in what other towns, were inside when the order was given? What does it cost today to live in a country that was built this way by people whose names we mostly no longer remember, in the dark, while the company calculated how long they would last on the air they had left? Cherry, Illinois is a small town. The mine is gone. The names are on the memorial. The story is in a few books. But the system that produced the disaster is not gone, and the assumptions that produced the order to seal the shaft are not gone. And if you want to understand the country you actually live in, as opposed to the country you were told you live in, you have to start here. You have to start with 21 men in the third vein, in the dark, listening for a rescue that the company had already decided was too expensive. You have to start with the silence of that shaft and the 8 days they sat in it, and the will that George Eddy wrote with a pencil on a scrap of paper to his wife and children. You have to ask, when you have finished reading those words, who exactly the modern world was built for, and who paid for it, and whether the bill has ever actually been settled. That is the story of the Cherry Mine. That is what they found, 8 days after they sealed the shaft in the dark of the third vein. Not just bodies, but the receipts. The receipts of an economic system that priced human beings at $1,800 apiece, that hired men who could not read its safety notices, that ran open flames next to hay bales because the electrical system was too expensive to repair, and that, when the fire came, gave the order to close the door and walk away. The men in the mine did not know they had been written off. They thought until the very last hour that someone was coming for them. 20 of them lived to find out the truth. The other 239 never did. The country they died building has for 100 years mostly chosen not to look at the receipts they left behind. Look at them now. Read the names on the memorial. Read the testimony from the hearings. Read the letters they wrote in the dark. Then ask yourself, what other shafts are still sealed and what is still inside them, waiting for someone with the courage to break the seal and finally let the air in. The history they taught you stops at the headline. The real story is in the third vein, where 21 men waited in absolute silence for 8 days, and one of them did not make it, and the rest came up to a world that had already decided they were dead. That world is the one you inherited. It is the one you live in now. The only question left is what you are going to do about it, now that you know what was actually buried in Cherry, Illinois, in the autumn of 1909.